Welcome to Fear Street.
There are lots of rumors out there about skinwalkers. Maybe I don't believe them. Maybe I think that coming from a different tribe makes me immune to their evil. Regardless of what I believe, there are things I've seen in the lonely places of Arizona that I cannot explain. The business of my family often takes us deep into the Navajo reservation and lends us to spending the night in a hotel or at a friend's place. However superstitious or practical you are, there can be no argument that those desolate desert roads are not always safe for travelers and locals alike after the sun sets. I know many people who have had dangerous encounters. On a trip to visit a relative near Canyon de Chile, we decided to attend an evening rug auction that took us a couple hours out of town. I was riding with my friend Jen, whose mother we were visiting. I would like to make a note that Jen is not the most stalwart of souls and is one of the more superstitious native people I know. On previous driving excursions, she's begged me to stop the car and take a different route after noticing an owl flying towards the road. I don't put much stock in omens. Anyhow, the auction hadn't ended by 9 p.m. or so, and Jen and I were getting antsy. We opted to head back to her mother's place early and let the rest of the family catch up with us. As Jen drove the two of us home on the empty 2-lane road, we quickly left all semblance of civilization behind for sheer night, which seemed even blacker in the shadow of the canyons. Jen had settled on the least fuzzy FM station she could find, and I was staring aimlessly out the window. That's when I noticed the dog. At first, it was just a flash of white in the corner of my vision, and then I craned my neck to get a good look. A big white German shepherd was running parallel to our car, about 100 yards off the road and a little behind us. Something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I knew we must have been going 40 or 45 miles per hour, but it was gaining on us. I could feel my heart rate pick up while I stared at it. As it came perpendicular to us, it began to draw up off of its feet until it was running on 2 legs like a human. When it turned its head to look at me, my stomach dropped. Even from that distance, I was sure I could see a red glint to its eyes, and a feeling of dread washed over me. I must have made a noise because Jen touched my leg and asked what was wrong. I glanced at her wordlessly and then gestured out the window. But as I turned back, the dog was gone. Not wanting to scare her, I told her the dark was playing tricks on me and closed my eyes, determined to sleep the rest of the way home. The next night, after a lot of food and even more visiting, I had holed up in my room to get ready for bed. I was staying in the 2nd floor of the house, and my window overlooked the street. The houses are fairly spread out, but the road is lined with street lamps, the nearest of which is less than a block away on the opposite side. I turned out my light and went to the window to pull down the shades so the light wouldn't keep me up. Fear hit me like a sucker punch when my eyes drifted across the road. There, in the light of the street lamp, was the German shepherd. It was standing on its hind legs in a way that I knew canine anatomy should not allow, and it was staring straight back at me. From that close, it was obvious that it had deep red eyes and fur that was a yellowish white. I don't know how long we watched each other. I knew better than to stare it in the eyes, but I was too terrified to turn away. Finally, it dropped down to all fours and walked away. I slept with a knife next to my bed and the bedroom door locked that night. Some part of me thinks it was a skinwalker that I saw, a witch out hunting for trouble. I haven't been back to Canyon de Chile. I was spending a month with my cousins at my grandma's house. It was August, and my cousins' ages ranged from 10 to 15, and I was the oldest, being 15. They were 10, 13, and 14. We stayed up telling scary stories often, but one night a few weeks in, we decided to make a campfire out back. My grandma's house is in a rural suburb. The neighbors aren't too far when you're driving down the road to her house, but in the backyard, it's thick forest with man-made paths through it. Each house is on a hill, so only part of the basement was actually underground. That isn't important until later, though. So we're towards the east side of her yard, in a small patch of open land. You couldn't see the neighboring yards from there, and there were probably 3/4 mile to each side of us that belonged to my grandma. It was maybe 11 at night, and we were playing truth or dare after telling scary stories. And my 14-year-old cousin dared me and the 13-year-old to go walk through the paths for 10 minutes. I said yes right away, as I wasn't easily scared and was rather level-headed, but my younger cousin was a bit more hesitant. We didn't bring a flashlight because it wasn't pitch dark yet, and we could see enough to keep us alive. We were walking through the paths for about 5 minutes, and could barely see the fire through the trees when we finally decided to turn. In the middle of the path was a large dog-like creature, hunched over, with its front hands an inch from the ground. What I remember most was how its eyes were so bright white, and it was humanoid dog-shaped, with a human-like head but a dog-like body, and human hands and feet. It looked right at us, and I was paralyzed with fear as it dashed away the opposite way from us, towards a creek that ran through the yard. Eventually my cousin and I screamed, and my other cousins and grandma ran to us. I don't remember much here because I was really disoriented and I couldn't think properly. But I did wake up in bed, so I assumed that I was brought up to the house. All the kids slept in the basement, in a big room with sliding glass doors to the outside, as the room was on the side that wasn't underground. My bed was pressed against the big glass window, and I could see my cousins playing outside, down below. The house is in Michigan, so it gets slightly chilly even in the end of August. And there was a slight breeze, so I put on a jacket and ran to join them outside, skipping breakfast, not wanting to miss out on anything fun. When I got down, I could tell they weren't playing, but rather running to get my grandma. Her dogs, both of them, were dead, ripped up. That night, we went to bed early. I woke up at maybe 2 a.m. because I felt something hit my head. My cousins were all sitting on the double bed opposite me on the other side of the room. There was one bunk and 2 double beds. The double beds for me and my 14-year-old cousin. They were being quiet and staring right at me. The 13-year-old nodded his head toward the window. I froze. They all looked afraid. I turned my head slightly to the side and I saw a really messed up looking face pressed to the window with gaping eyes looking down at me. I screamed as loud as I could and it bolted. My grandma called the police after I told her what happened, and they found nothing. I went home after that, and I've never been there during the night again. I decided to join my best friend Karen for a 3-day stay at her grandmother's place on the res. Her grandmother lives near a place called Tuba City, Arizona, in the middle of nowhere, but surrounded by rural homes. We go to college together, and I was interested to know about Navajo tradition. The first day we stayed, it was pretty chill, nothing out of the ordinary, but then her grandma, who wasn't that old, around 67, said that a stray dog came out of nowhere and wouldn't leave. To me, it did act kind of strange, and it was ugly. It had a black shaggy coat and looked like a mix between a German Shepherd and a lab. That night, we were watching a movie in the living room. The living room had big windows that looked out into the front where the cars are parked, nothing fancy, and the curtains were wide open. Grandma was in the kitchen cooking dinner, and we were watching a movie. Next to the window is a medium-sized bookshelf and where DVDs are kept. Karen went to put a DVD in that we had just watched, but she freaked out because that stray black dog was staring at us through the window, standing on top of the wood box outside. It's not something normal dogs do from my point of view, or hers. Usually my dog, which is a house dog, scratches the door to be let in. Res dogs aren't house dogs, and dogs inside houses are frowned upon in Navajo tradition, meant to protect the house and owner. The other dogs seemed to stay away from it. Karen opened the door and yelled at it to get off the box. It ran off behind the shed. We went to Tuba City to get some groceries and came back to the house. The dog was nowhere to be seen, and there was nothing unusual. Grandma went to visit some people, so it was just Karen and I at this point. At about 5 o'clock, we heard someone trying to open the door. Both of us looked out since we hadn't seen or heard a car, and the dogs weren't barking. We were looking out the living room window to the door, and there was the dog trying to open the door with its paws. 2 paws wrapped around the brass doorknob, standing on its hind legs. I thought that was weird, but wasn't really freaked out. Karen was, though. She opened the door and chased it off. Grandma came back later, and Karen told her. Grandma didn't like what she had heard. We got ready to sleep, and we slept in the spare bedroom since it had 2 beds. One window had curtains and was opened a little. We turned off the light, but there was a sound coming from on top of the roof. We heard the pitter-patter of footsteps and scratching sounds and panting. It then sounded like it jumped off onto the large plastic water barrel they had. At first, we heard what sounded like barking, but as it grew louder, the other dogs seemed to be barking at something also. All of a sudden, something was running around the house barking, but it didn't sound like a dog. This barking sounded human. It was a deep male voice, barking like it knew that we knew it wasn't a dog. Then panting again by the window, and we started freaking out. Karen decided to open the curtains to look out. There was the stray dog on its hind legs, looking into our bedroom, but this time it stunk, and what I thought were 2 black holes in the neck, another pair of eyes, twinkled, and the paws were deformed-looking hands with overgrown, thick, sharp fingernails. We both screamed and shut the curtains closed, and Grandma came running through the door and saw it. The first thing she did was grab ashes from the fireplace, load 3 shells into the shotgun from under her bed, bless herself in Navajo, and go outside to shoot it, yelling in Navajo about how that thing wasn't welcome there and to get the hell out of there, for it to go linger somewhere else. Them both being traditional, the next day they called a medicine man to come over and put cedar in. He prayed over everyone with cedar smoke and an eagle feather, blessed the place, made us eat bitter herbs called eagle's gall, and gave me an arrowhead. Apparently I needed to carry one for protection, and a little pouch called corn pollen. The medicine man said the dog was a skinwalker. The body of the stray dog, which was killed by the skinwalker, made an illusion, so we wouldn't know it wasn't a real dog. He also said that they tend to harm people by using some sort of human bone straw to spit at someone and get human bones into them. Doctors can't detect it, but the medicine man that day pulled a piece of human skull out of Grandma's right shoulder. It was pretty big, about 2 inches long and 1 centimeter thick. It was real. We watched him pull it out of her. When I was a kid, my uncle and I were finishing up chopping firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. This was on the Navajo Res here in Arizona. Driving back on a dirt road at about 30 miles per hour, I had this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't." I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest, then completely stopped when I heard a tap tap on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on and thought it was over until our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me and don't turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and sighed. It was quiet besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We'll ask your father to do a prayer in the morning so the evil will forget our faces." I remember curling up on the seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time, listening to my uncle sing an old prayer till we got to my grandmother's house. I later called my uncle because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit. He said, "I didn't see faces, just eyes, like brake lights you see on the road. It watched you." Before hanging up, I tried joking with him about it. "Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back?" No laughter, just a pause. Because it wasn't alone. Before I tell my story, I'll summarize what a skinwalker is for those who may not know. A skinwalker is a being that uses witchcraft, kills an animal, and uses the skin as a disguise. It's mainly active at night, but will observe during the day. Its favorite disguise is that of a regular human. A skinwalker's most noticeable traits are yellow glowing eyes and decaying flesh. Anyway, I was heading to a small town in southern Utah with my wife and a couple of friends. We were on our way to see Lee, a friend of mine that we hadn't seen in a long time. We met up with him at his place and decided to hang out at a nearby lake. It was a typical quiet campsite with a fire pit and a couple of logs around it. We had a little picnic there and were exchanging stories and catching up with each other all day. Eventually, one of my friends, Bryce, got tired and decided to fall asleep in the car while the rest of us continued talking. At this point, twilight had fallen. Erica and I were discussing something, while my wife and Lee were talking about something else. All of a sudden, my wife and Lee fell silent. Erica and I quickly noticed. We looked at them and Lee says, "Get in the car." I asked him, "What's wrong?" And he says, "There might be a skinwalker around." Now, Erica and I had no idea what a skinwalker was at the time, so we asked him to explain. After his explanation of what it was, Erica and I, being the only sensible thinkers at the moment, and Bryce just barely waking up from us jumping in the car, decided we should investigate, believing that it was probably just some kids in a nearby campsite trying to mess with us. We came to the top of the hill that was between our campsite and the next, and looked for any likely candidates for the scare. There were none. All we could see was a couple of trees and some bushes. We even called out, but there was no response. As we were walking back to the campsite, we heard noises, a rustling in the bushes behind us. We look again, but see nothing. At this point, we were considering that Lee and my wife may be right. We get back and it's getting dark fast, so I asked them, "Is there something we can do to keep them away for a little bit?" "Yes," said Lee. "They don't like fire." And him, my wife, and Bryce start working on a fire, while me and Erica go down by the lake to collect the 2 liters we had put in the water to keep cold. Now it's dark, and as Erica and I head back with the sodas, we hear rustling in the bushes beside us. We're both scared. We hurry back and put everything back in the car as quickly as possible, while Lee made sure the fire kept burning. After getting everything in the car, I rush over to the fire pit and tell everyone to get in the car as I proceed to stomp the fire out. Right as the fire went out, I hear a blood-curdling scream from across the lake. I felt my heart stop. Lee had said skinwalkers are fast. They can make a full lap around this lake in a matter of seconds. I jump in the car and yell, "Go!" Right as the engine started and the lights come on, we see it coming out of the bushes in front of us. Glowing yellow eyes and what looked like a zombified coyote with decaying flesh. We backed up and peeled out of there as fast as we could. This happened 2 years ago, and it still scares me to know how close I came to death. I'm honestly amazed that we all survived such a close encounter with this thing. It was 1995. I had just graduated high school. An old friend who I haven't talked to in 7 years now and I were hanging out, and I said, "Let's go to New Orleans." So we did. We had $140 between us, and back then, that was more than enough. We made it to New Orleans, almost died from culture shock, and then turned around and headed to Magnolia, Mississippi to get some sleep. We stayed at Magnolia Inn. It was a crap hole, but it was nice and cool. It was May or June in South Mississippi. Cool was the only adjective that mattered. We stayed up that night playing poker, drinking Gordon's vodka, and talking about who knows what. Probably girls, college and college girls. At some point, I said, "Ever been to Texas?" "Nope." "Pack your bag and let's roll." We had a road atlas. Marshall, Texas was right across the border from Shreveport. We arrived in Shreveport, made a phone call to another friend, who we were actually supposed to be staying with. Both of our mothers had called looking for us. The only person that knew where we were was the buddy on the phone. It was no big deal. We'd be home in a day or two. I'm being short on details because if I don't, this will turn into a novel-length story about chasing armadillos and being chased by the boogeyman. Before we left that rest area in Shreveport where we made the call, we saw an armadillo. Let me tell you something about armadillos. Those bastards will hiss, jump, and turn into Tasmanian devils if you corner them. They also carry leprosy. We were 18. We chased that armadillo around for an hour. Now let me tell you about Shreveport. I don't know how it is now, but in the summer of '95, it looked and smelled like a place where oil and metal went to die. It was dirty. It was a crap hole. We crossed a bridge and saw people fishing about 100 yards from where a drainage pipe from a factory was spewing forth waste upriver from the fishermen. The locals reminded me of the locals in Adamsville. Bald-headed women and cross-eyed men. A lot of bald-headed, cross-eyed kids. I'm sorry, but it was a Rob Zombie movie come to life. I felt like I was going to be raped because I had a full head of hair and could see straight. The best part of Shreveport was an armadillo that might possibly have leprosy. Marshall, Texas was a good 40 miles away. We rolled on. Marshall was a decent little town, home of the Fire Ant Festival. We stopped at a little barbecue joint and had a Coke, a smile, and some pulled pork. It was getting late and the sun was setting. We looked at the map and decided to backtrack a bit and head up rural Route 43, through Karnak, and past Caddo Lake. We'd eventually run into Highway 59, head to Texarkana, and then head back home. When we left the barbecue joint and headed towards 43, it was dusk. Highway 43 wasn't well lit. It was almost as dark as Natchez Trace Parkway. My friend was driving and we were doing about 45 miles per hour. Any faster would have been reckless, even for a couple 18-year-old dumbasses. This road was kind of like Christmasville Road. The locals reading this will know what I mean. The non-locals will just have to use your imagination. It was dark, winding, full of hills that ended in curves. There were beady and glowing eyes on both sides of the road. You could hear the crickets and the bullfrogs over the sound of the wind rushing by that old Sentra. It was peaceful and creepy at the same time. The humidity was a real thing, tangible. The air was thick. It smelled like pastures, hay, and swamp. We drove for what seemed like hours. It was after midnight, and I saw a sign that informed me that Bivens was the next town of any size. I was hypnotized by the yellow lines on the road. We hadn't seen another car in at least an hour. Sleepy, I rolled down the window and lit a cigarette. There was music coming from the radio, the tape player. It was either Tupac or Bob Seger. I smoked my cigarette, absent-mindedly flicking ashes out of the window. I took one last puff and flicked the Camel short off into the woods. Then I saw it. I never looked to my right. I didn't even kind of peek to the right. Maybe I did a little when I flicked the cigarette away. I don't know. What I do know is that in my periphery there was something running alongside the car. It was just behind my window, behind where the edge of the door ends, and before where the back window begins. I looked over at the speedometer, 40 miles per hour. I looked at my friend. He was looking straight ahead. I looked straight ahead, but I could still see it. I could see one huge arm, matted hair, reddish brown, sticky looking, primal. I eased my right hand over and rolled up my window. My friend was still looking straight ahead. His jaw was clenched, and he put both hands on the wheel and sped up. No words were said. I looked straight ahead, and still out of my periphery, I could see that arm moving, muscles and tendons visibly rippling beneath that matted hair. As the car gained a little speed, the thing running alongside us lost pace slightly. I then saw the hand on the end of that nightmarish arm. The hand was clenched into a fist the size of a cantaloupe, a big cantaloupe. It was covered in the same hair, but slightly darker around the fingers, like it was stained with something. Suddenly, the hand unclenched, and then I saw the claws. Black as this damned after midnight Texas night. Those claws were at least 2 inches long, sharp, like an animal's. This wasn't a hand so much as it was the killing paw and claws of some beast whose only purpose was to kill and eat. I looked back at my friend. I looked at the speedometer, 50 miles per hour. I looked straight ahead. It was still there. I lit another cigarette, didn't roll the window down, and simply said, "Shit." The music had stopped. I finally broke the silence and said, "Hey, do you?" And before I could finish, my buddy said, "I see it. I've been seeing it. I can't even see you, but I can see whatever the hell that thing is." "How much do you see?" "More than I want to." "Speed up, John. Just speed up. It can't keep up forever." I looked over. 55 miles per hour. Whatever was chasing us silently was starting to lag behind. I finally looked to my right, just a bit. Imagine the scary part of the movie where you put your hands in front of your face but still peek through. In 37 years, I have 2 regrets. One is picking up that first cigarette, and the other is me looking to my right that night. This beast was huge. Its chest was above the top of the car, and all I could see was that matted reddish-brown hair. Then it bent forward as it ran, and I saw the face of this thing. All reality stopped. We were no longer driving down some country road in Texas. We were now trying to escape from the depths of a monster-inhabited hell. This thing's face is beyond my powers to describe. It was evil. The eyes were black and the pupils were red. It flashed its teeth at me in a snarl, yellow and huge. Saliva dripped from its mouth. It opened its eyes wide and it looked hungry and mad. Then it opened its mouth. The skin pulled back until all I could see were black gums and yellow teeth. Immediately, I could feel the car accelerate. "Go, John, just go!" I prayed. I cussed. I lit a cigarette. Then, like sunshine breaking through the clouds, the road straightened out. "Don't you slow down." We drove through Bivens, and we drove to Texarkana. Then we drove home. We never said a word. It was years later, 11 to be exact, before we ever even talked about it again, and even then, we didn't talk about it much. He said he'd never told anyone, and I hadn't either. I told the story a few years back for the first time, while I was parked out on a gravel road, doing the things you do when you're parked out on a gravel road with a good-looking woman. I told it a year or so ago to a couple of kids who wanted to hear a scary story while they sat around a campfire. They didn't sleep for a day or two, but they asked me a dozen more times to tell them the story. I never told anyone until now that I saw its face. I've been scared for my life exactly 2 times. Once was on that road, and once was looking at a grizzly bear in front of me with a terminal velocity inducing drop to the side of me. Call it what you will, Call it bullshit if you want, but look me in the eyes and let me tell you this story and you'll know. Never doubt that there are things in this world that defy explanation and logic. The boogeyman is real. We're walking a bridle trail, bow hunting, in Nipissing Swamp State Natural Area, when I started to feel like we were being watched. I kept it to myself, however, and we continued walking the trail until we reached a point where the path branched off to the right, and a snowmobile trail went to the left. I went to that corner the last few days, but always stopped because I just had an odd feeling about continuing. We had just moved to Two Rivers a few months ago and weren't familiar with the area. We had just started hunting there a few days prior, and the odd feeling had been enough to convince me to turn back on previous excursions. This time, though, something convinced me to ignore that feeling and go further. As my wife and I reached the fork, something not far off the trail ran off through the woods. It seemed so big, I felt it in the ground. Believing it must be a large buck, we proceeded down the trail, hoping to get a glimpse of it. We found it about 50 yards up, where the trail opened into a stand of tall pines. It was behind a tree, and at first appeared to be a bear standing on its back legs, scratching its back against the tree trunk. It kept stepping to the side, and I could see what looked like a shoulder and a really long arm. But it looked black, really black. Then it did something funny, almost like it got down on all fours, and I thought I saw what would be its head, but it was very oddly shaped, almost like a football, but horizontal, with very long ears pointing up into the back. And I thought what I believed to be very long, almost grayish hair. I estimate it to be 8 to 10 feet tall, with long, thin, gangly arms. My wife and I watched it briefly, unable to understand what we were looking at. Then it took 3 large steps and disappeared into the underbrush. We slowly walked toward the tree where the creature had been standing, where we saw large impressions in the ground. I thought maybe it had been another hunter dressed in a ghillie suit, though I knew it was way too tall to be human. "Hello?" I said quietly. There was no response. I called out a few more times, but there was only silence. We decided we'd better get out of there because it was starting to get dark and we were both pretty freaked out. All the way back, it felt like somebody was trailing us alongside the trail, keeping up with us as we walked very fast. About a quarter mile from the road where our vehicle was parked, my wife and I walked out of the forest into a field. We saw a deer there, standing sideways, out in the open. A perfect shot. We had come out to hunt, after all. So I raised my bow and nocked an arrow. I used lighted knocks so you could easily see the trajectory of my arrow. When I shot, you could see that I shot low, and I heard something like my arrow hitting something. But I wasn't sure if I hit the deer or not, so we walked over there and started looking for my arrow, still constantly watching around us, and we couldn't find my arrow anywhere. Then I spotted the glowing knock about 20 or 30 yards back toward the woods and the path. My arrow was stuck basically vertical in the ground, except leaning the opposite way I shot, which to me and my wife seemed impossible, that my arrow could be the way it was in the ground. As we made our way back toward the road to leave, a strong odor filled the air. I smelled the most horrible smell I've ever smelled in my life, like rot and mud and sulfur. A nasty smell that was just right in my face. My wife smelled it as well and later described it to me as a very strong metallic odor of something metal. We hurried back to our vehicle and headed home, but that night still haunts me. I'm a very avid bow hunter and have spent most of my life out in the woods. I've never encountered anything like this or felt the feeling I felt when I was out there. This experience left me feeling uneasy about going back out into the woods, and I'm questioning whether I'll ever go out hunting again. I spend a lot of time camping and hiking in the mountains of northern Georgia with my brother Ryan. On this particular day, we headed out to a place we knew well, midway through Jack's River Trail in the Cohutta Wilderness. We searched for a good secluded area to set up camp for a planned 2-night stay. We got everything set up, and after a day of hiking and exploring the Jack's River, the trip seemed to be off to a great start. That night, we got a fire going, had dinner, and sat chatting away until a sound caught our attention. We were very familiar with the sounds of the forest, but this sounded off to us. It was as if several people were walking around the campsite, trying not to be heard. Then things got very bizarre. I remember we both pulled out our flashlights and shined them in the direction we felt the sounds were coming from. But that's what was so weird. Whenever we'd fix our lights on a spot we thought the sounds were coming from, the location of the sound would suddenly change. That's when the whistling started. At first, I thought it was the wind, and I remember thinking maybe the wind is just throwing leaves around and what we're hearing is nothing but the wilderness around us. Ryan looked at me and asked if I was hearing it. I didn't answer and was trying to focus hard on each individual sound. 2 consecutive notes with roughly a 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes, over and over again. Ryan kept asking if I heard it, and I put my finger to my lips, trying to keep him quiet. The fear I felt was incredible. My jaw was tight, my fist clenched, knowing I wasn't ready for whatever was out there, if it was anything at all. The whistling continued for what felt like forever, but thinking it through, it was maybe 5 minutes when Ryan finally yelled out into the darkness, "Hey! Quiet!" The whistling stopped. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, when suddenly the woods erupted with noise. Something or someone was running in a circle around our campsite. The whistling came back. 2 consecutive notes with the same 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes. How could someone whistle this loudly without cracking while also running? I was done. I stood up, shining my flashlight in all directions, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was screwing with us. Nothing. It felt close enough to touch, but we never saw a thing. That's when the movement stopped, but the whistling was still constant. It was so loud, inhumanly loud. I looked at Ryan and told him to call the police. Now, this is the part I'll never forget, the part I never like to talk about. While Ryan was on the phone with the dispatcher and telling them our location and what was going on, I stepped around the fire towards my tent. Inside my bag, I had a 6-inch fixed blade that I always carried and thought I'd feel a bit more comfortable with it in my hand, more than just my flashlight. As I went to unzip my tent, trying to keep my eyes toward the woods, I heard some movement directly in front of me. I swept my light up in front of me, and for maybe 2 seconds, I saw it. Whatever this person or thing was, it was about 5 feet up in a tree. Everything about it was long. Its arms, legs, neck, fingers, everything. And it was fast. As soon as the light hit it, it launched backwards off the tree. I heard it land, but it either jumped an impossible distance or landed in a thicket, because I heard it, but never saw. I don't think I've ever yelled so loudly. I ran back to where Ryan was and sat down. He kept asking me what I saw, but I couldn't answer. I just kept thinking about it. Maybe 10 minutes later, we saw a couple of flashlight beams coming through the woods, and about 3 guys came into view, asking if everything was okay. I settled down a bit and started asking them if they had seen or heard anything. All they said was they heard a lot of movement, and then they heard my scream. That's when they headed our direction. I tried to explain what had happened without sounding crazy, but it didn't seem to work. One of the guys walked around a bit and came back and said he didn't see anything. Ryan told them that we called the police, and roughly 30 minutes later, a park ranger showed up. Ryan and I tried explaining everything to him, but he just chalked it up to either a curious animal or some campers trying to mess with us. It all started with finding mutilated animals around my property in a rather grisly fashion, including dead foxes and deer that had had their spinal columns torn out and strewn around, as well as vicious claw and teeth marks and limbs rendered from their bodies. Sometimes these animals were disemboweled, and their entrails found hanging from bushes or trees like macabre Christmas tree ornaments. And sometimes they were simply torn in half, with one of the halves missing. It was all very unsettling indeed, but it was about to graduate into the horrifying. So let me lay out the land for you. My house is about 100 yards from a small stream that splits the small wooded area in half. On the far side of the stream from my house, there are large trees. I was out there one day, and all of a sudden, I felt cold and uncomfortable, like I was being watched. I also became increasingly paranoid that someone or something was out there with me, so I decided to head in. The sun was also setting, and dusk would be upon me soon. So I started walking towards my house, which would mean that I'd have to walk uphill. I wasn't in a rush and was taking my time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. So I turned around, and I saw a large creature about 80 yards from me, standing across the stream. It then proceeded to take a step towards me. I knew that in order to make it out of the woods, I'd have to run about 20 yards uphill, which would take me about 30 to 40 seconds. But I ran out of those woods in about 10. It was the most scared I've ever been, and the most adrenaline has ever flowed through me. Now, you might be wondering, could I have been dehydrated or hallucinating? Well, I've never hallucinated in my life, and I couldn't have been dehydrated because about 10 minutes prior to this event, I drank an entire bottle of water, and I always make sure I'm hydrated before I go exploring. There's no way it was a tree because every time I go out there, I go to where I spotted it, and there isn't a single tree small enough to look even remotely like what I saw. Since then, I haven't spotted it, but I have heard it. It's believed by Native Americans that Wendigos call out for help in the voice of humans in order to lure people toward them. I've heard what sounds like a little girl calling for help in those woods before. It's still terrifying to talk or think about. This happened back in high school, on prom night. I was a sophomore, just helping take down decorations. I was 16 and it might have been 1 a.m. by the time I was driving home from the train station where the prom was held, in rural Southern Virginia. At the time, I drove a 1994 F-150, which was built like a tank. I wasn't super familiar with the roads around the train station, but the one I was on had cornfields on both sides for a few acres back. Then it turned into deep woods. So, I'm heading home, doing maybe 45, when all of a sudden, half of my truck pops up and down, like I've just hit the mother of all speed bumps on one side. And having just got my license, I was panicked. So I pulled over to make sure I hadn't blown a tire. I put the truck in park and looked back for a second, and I see this huge mass just laying in the middle of the road that 100% was not there when I stopped. My first instinct is, I just killed someone's dog, and my heart dropped. I've got my hand on the door handle, ready to go see if this dog is okay, when suddenly, the hair on my arm stands up. On instinct, I look in the rearview mirror to see the thing getting up. At first, I was happy that it was alive, but then it stood up on 2 legs. Mind you, this was all illuminated by my brake lights in the middle of nowhere, and I was pretty freaked out. But when it stood up, I could tell it was kind of hunched over, and even then, it was almost as tall as the 9 or 10-foot corn in the fields. Massive rib cage, emaciated, long face, hollow-looking thing just stands up and looks dead at me before shuffling across the road back into the fields. I drove home, cried a bit, and went to sleep. The next morning, I found a massive dent in my fender, and I knew that I had really hit something. It messed me up for a good while, and now I still don't like driving at night. A few days ago, my sister and I took a ride on our horses. I'd say our horses are pretty much spook-proof. They sit still when we shoot rifles off their backs. So when they got spooked at a tall, dark, twisted figure in the corner of the woods, we flipped out and booked it back to the barn. We rode them straight into the barn so we wouldn't get knocked off when they ran back into their stalls. My sister was in a separate stall opposite me with her horse. We locked the stalls and bolted the doors shut from the inside. This was a feature I never thought we'd need. Since there were deadbolts on the inside of the stalls and wood window covers, there was no way inside. Whatever it was that had been following us was chasing us closely through the field, and I think we barely escaped. I didn't even notice my horse was bleeding on her left hip. I felt her kick while we were riding away, but I didn't think something had actually got her. She was sweaty and I could see the white in her eyes. I stood away from the window and the door. My father must have seen us, or that thing, because we heard gunshots coming from the right side of the barn, going towards the field. I called out to my sister, asking if she was okay. She was, but her horse was hurt, just like mine. She asked if I had seen what it was that scared the horses. I told her I barely saw anything. To be honest, I still don't know what it was, but it was thin and dark and smelled rotten. It left claw marks deep in our horses' sides. They'll have matching scars, but I don't think they'll let us take them back to the woods. They haven't left their stalls for over 2 days. My dad described the thing as a really mutated and mangled dog. He said he shot at it when it started to run into the barn. He made it bleed, but we haven't found the body. To be fair, he was pretty far away from it, so he didn't really get a good look. I was visiting my parents and their many cats in the Texas Hill Country during the hot summer months. The house was along a creek, and one evening one of the cats named Topaz, who followed me around on my walks around the property, was with me. We'd often walk along the creek, but this particular evening, Topaz was unwilling to cross in her usual spot. It was eerily quiet. I noticed a little later that she was acting as if something was threatening her, so I looked up, and that's when I saw it. This thing had long arms and it was tall. I don't remember anything like talons or claws, but I do remember antlers and matted fur. It wasn't gaunt or skeletal. It had very large dark eyes, oriented forward like a predator's would be. The weirdest thing about the whole situation was just being entirely overcome with fear and dread, literally to the point of vomiting. After I puked, I sprinted back up to the house with Topaz and avoided the creek for ages. Though, strangely, I felt quite certain that whatever that thing was, it couldn't cross running water. After a month, it felt like it had gone and it was safe to go over there again. Now, as far as I know, there's no family history on either side for hallucinations. And even if there were, this would have been my only experience with one in my entire life. It's been almost a full decade since that happened. Mostly, I'm wondering if anything of this description and presence has been encountered before, especially in Texas.